Don't do that. Please.
Don't do that. Please. He stood close enough to feel her breath slow. His hand moved toward the blanket. She stiffened beneath it and whispered, "Don't, please." Her voice was thin and dry, already fading, as Caleb Hartman's fingers brushed the edge of the blanket wrapped around her body. The summer heat of southern Arizona pressed down like a hand on his neck, but her skin felt cold beneath the cloth. Caleb froze, halfway through lifting the blanket. His breath stuck somewhere between anger and disbelief. She was lying on the back of a wagon, parked in full sun, the wood beneath her dark with old sweat and newer blood. Her face was pale, lips cracked, freckles standing out like stains on white paper. When the blanket shifted, he saw bruises blooming along her thigh, yellow and purple, some fresh, some older, all of them placed by a hand that didn't care if she lived. The curve of her belly was impossible to miss. She was pregnant, far enough along that no one could pretend otherwise, and still someone had left her out here like freight. Caleb's hand tightened. Not on the blanket, but on the anger rising up his spine. He'd come to Tombstone that morning to settle paperwork, brand inspection. Nothing more than a rancher doing what the territory demanded if a man wanted to move cattle without trouble. Deputy Silas Crowley had smiled thinly, tapped the star on his chest, and said inspections were done at home now, since rustlers were getting bold. Caleb had followed because arguing with a badge in this country usually cost more than it saved. Now he stood in a dirt yard behind a small house at the edge of town, staring at a woman who looked like she'd been punished for breathing. Her fingers caught his sleeve, weak but desperate. "Don't do that," she whispered again, softer this time, like the words were heavier than she was. Caleb looked toward the house, then toward the road, then back at her. His instincts were screaming at him to turn around, ride hard, and bring every man with a conscience back here. But she shook her head, slow and careful, like even moving too much might break something inside her. "If you make noise," she said, "if you call anyone, it'll be worse when you're gone." That sentence landed harder than any threat Caleb had heard in the war. He'd seen men die loud and fast, but this was something different. This was a woman learning how to survive quietly. Caleb eased the blanket back into place, not because she asked, but because he couldn't stand seeing more. Her eyes stayed on his face, searching it, measuring whether he was the kind of man who would listen, or the kind who would decide for... He swallowed, tasting dust and something bitter. "What happened to you?" he asked, voice low and steady like you'd use on a spooked horse. She didn't answer right away. A fly landed on her cheek, and she didn't have the strength to shoo it. That's when Caleb noticed the rope tied to the wagon axle. It wasn't for hauling. It was short, knotted, and rubbed raw where it had been pulled tight. Something in his chest shifted, slow and dangerous. Deputy Crowley stepped out onto the porch then, hat tilted back, hands relaxed, like this was all perfectly ordinary. "Morning, Hartman," he said. Easy as conversation over coffee. Inspection's almost done. Caleb didn't look at him. He kept his eyes on the woman. She closed hers when she heard her husband's voice. Silas Crowley walked closer, boots crunching on gravel, and rested a hand on the wagon rail. "She's sickly," he said, shaking his head, like it was a nuisance he'd been saddled with. Condition like that makes a man wonder. Caleb finally turned. "Wonder what?" he asked. Silas smiled, and the smile didn't reach his eyes. "Whether a thing belongs to you," he said. The words hung there, heavy with meaning. Caleb understood then. This wasn't about discipline or temper or even cruelty for its own sake. This was about doubt, about a man who thought ownership extended to blood and breath, and who punished anything that threatened his certainty. Caleb felt his hand drift, low, toward the butt of his revolver. He could already see how this would end. If he let it, a short sound, a body falling, a woman screaming, or maybe not even having the strength, a noose later, somewhere public, because that's how things balanced out here. That was when her hand tightened again, surprising him with the strength she still had left. "Don't," she said, clearer now, firmer. "Please." Her eyes were open, locked on his. not begging for mercy, but for restraint. In that look, Caleb saw fear, yes, but also calculation. She wasn't asking him to save her pride. She was asking him not to make a choice that would destroy everything that came after. Silas watched the exchange, his jaw tightening, his smile fading. "You done looking?" "Hartman," he said. Caleb straightened, measured. He nodded once, like a man swallowing something bitter. "Inspection's fine," he said. Silas chuckled, satisfied, and turned back toward the house. Caleb stayed where he was for a moment longer. The woman opened her eyes again. There was relief there, mixed with something darker, regret, maybe, that this was the only way she knew to stay alive. Caleb mounted his horse and rode out of the yard without looking back. The sound of the wagon creaking behind him, following him down the road. The sun hadn't moved, but the day felt different now, heavier. He told himself he'd done the right thing. He told himself there would be another way. But as Tombstone came back into view, he didn't ride in like a man looking for a fight. He rode past the noise, past the lamps, and kept going. He didn't want Crowley seeing him go straight to the sheriff while the bruises were still fresh in his mind. One question settled in his mind, sharp and unforgiving. When the law is the one holding the rope, how far can a man go to save a life? Without losing his own soul, Caleb didn't slow his horse until Tombstone was a good distance behind him. The road stretched out flat and pale, heat rolling off it in waves, the kind of heat that made a man second-guess every thought he had. He kept seeing her face, not the bruises first, though those stayed with him, but the way she looked at him when she said, "Please." That wasn't fear alone. That was a woman doing math in her head, counting how many ways the day could still end badly, and choosing the one that hurt the least. Caleb had lived long enough to recognize that look. He'd seen it on men in uniform who knew the charge would fail, but went anyway. He'd seen it on ranch hands who stayed quiet because a loud truth would cost them their job. Still, it sat wrong in his gut. He reached his ranch near the San Pedro River by mid-afternoon. The cottonwoods barely moved, even the wind too tired to argue with the sun. Caleb unsaddled slowly, his joints reminding him he was no longer young, then stood there longer than necessary, staring at nothing. He told himself to let it go. He told himself she wasn't his responsibility. He told himself that stepping into another man's house and another man's marriage, and especially one with a badge, was how decent men got buried. But the words didn't stick. That night, sleep came in short stretches. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the rope tied to the wagon axle. He saw how careful she'd been with her breath. He saw the way Deputy Crowley smiled, like a man who'd already decided how the world worked and saw no reason to change it. By morning, Caleb knew he wasn't done with this, even if he didn't yet know what done looked like. Caleb had learned something about towns like Tombstone. A man could get himself killed two ways. He could draw fast, or he could talk too much, so he kept his questions small and his eyes wide. He made himself useful in places where men let their guard down. He bought a round he didn't drink. He listened to the way people said Crowley's name, and the way they avoided saying it at all. It wasn't fear like a rattlesnake fear. It was the tired kind, the kind folks carry when they've complained before, and nothing changed. On the road to Benson, the heat followed him like a debt, and the empty land reminded him what the territory did to anyone who fell behind. And he kept thinking about that rope on the act, not because it was dramatic, because it was practical. A man like Crowley didn't tie a rope for show. He tied it because it worked. Caleb told himself he was only gathering facts, but his hands kept tightening on the reins every time he imagined her trying to breathe under that blanket. He started wondering what kind of man he had become, the kind who rides away and calls it wisdom, or the kind who rides back and calls it duty. Neither one felt clean. Folks don't say that out loud. In the territory, sometimes you chose between two wrong roads and prayed you picked the one that let you sleep later. By the time the Benson Road came into view, Caleb already knew this was bigger than a bad marriage. A bad man could bruise one woman. A bad system could bruise a whole town. The next day he rode into Benson, not in a hurry, not like a man chasing trouble, but like someone with business that couldn't be ignored. Benson was quieter than Tombstone. Less noise, fewer eyes that ask questions for sport. He stopped at a small boarding house near the tracks, the kind of place where folks passed through and didn't always leave their stories behind. The woman who ran it looked him over once, then poured him coffee without asking. "You look like a man who slept poorly," she said. He smiled thin. "I'm getting good at that." He asked casual questions, nothing sharp. Had she seen a young woman come through a few months back? The woman squinted a moment, then finally said her name. Maggie, brown hair, light eyes. Carrying herself carefully, the woman hesitated just long enough to answer the question. "Stayed a short while," she said. "Worked in the kitchen." Quiet type. Left looking worse than she arrived. That was enough. Caleb thanked her and stepped back outside. The pieces started to line up, steady and clear. That night, back at the ranch, Caleb did not sit down to rest. He walked his corrals with a lantern, checking gates that were already latched. He ran his hand along the fence post and felt fresh scrape marks, like something had been dragged close, then pulled away. It could have been nothing. Could have been everything. That is how trouble works. It never announces itself. It just leaves small signs and waits to see who notices. He found his foreman by the tack room and asked one question. "Anybody been riding the South Line after dark?" The foreman shrugged and said no, not that he'd seen, but he would not meet Caleb's eyes when he said it. Caleb filed that away too. A man doesn't look away unless he's hiding something, or scared of something, or both. Caleb took the sloppy brand mark he'd seen by the river and drew it on a scrap of paper. Just a rough shape. Then he pulled out his own brand papers and compared the lines. Close, but not quite. That was the trick. A small change that could turn your cattle into somebody else's story. He thought about Crowley's words. Paperwork can say whatever you need it to say. Back in the war, men called that strategy, and out here, they called it law. He sat on his porch with the lantern low and heard a horse far off in the dark. Just one, not coming fast, just passing, like a man checking distance. Caleb never saw the rider, but he felt the message anyway. Crowley was already reaching, already testing, already deciding how much Caleb would give up before he broke. That is when Caleb understood the real danger. Crowley was not going to take one strip of land and stop. A man like that never stops. He keeps taking until somebody finally stands still and says no. And if Caleb was going to say no, he had to pick the moment, because one wrong moment would not just cost him his ranch. It would cost her life. Back at the ranch, Caleb checked his cattle, walked the fence line, did the things a rancher does when he's thinking hard. He noticed a marker out of place near the riverbank, a brand burned sloppy. Almost careless. It didn't belong to him, and it didn't belong to any neighbor he knew. That was when the other shoe dropped. Deputy Crowley hadn't been inspecting for rustlers. He'd been laying groundwork. A man with a badge didn't need to steal outright. He just needed to blur the lines, make honest cattle look questionable, make honest men look guilty. Caleb realized then that the woman on the wagon wasn't just trapped by a husband. She was trapped by a system that had already decided her value. That afternoon, Caleb rode into Tombstone again, careful this time. He kept his hat low, his mouth shut, and his ears open. In the saloon, he heard Crowley's name more than once. Not spoken kindly, not spoken openly either. A man who enforced rules different depending on who was paying. A man who liked his authority simple and his temper unchecked. Caleb sat with a beer he barely touched, listening. He laughed when it was expected. He kept his hands on the table. No reason to give Crowley a show yet. When he left, he nearly ran into Crowley himself, just outside the door. The deputy looked him up and down. "Back so soon, Hartman," he said. Caleb shrugged. "Paperwork has a way of following a man." Crowley smirked. "Funny thing about paperwork," he said. "It can say whatever you need it to say." Caleb nodded, like he'd learned a long time ago when to keep his mouth shut. They parted without another word, but something had changed. Crowley knew Caleb was thinking. Caleb knew Crowley was watching. That evening, Caleb made a decision, and not a loud one, not a brave one, at least not yet. He decided to wait, to learn, to see where the cracks were before trying to force anything open. Because charging in hadn't helped her yesterday, and it wouldn't help her tomorrow either. He sat on his porch as the sun dropped low, the sky turning the color of old copper. Somewhere miles away, a woman lay under a blanket on a wagon, counting hours instead of dreams. Caleb lifted his cup, now filled with something stronger than coffee. "If you've made it this far," he said quietly, "stick with me a little longer. If these old stories are your kind of company, subscribe and stay with me. Settle in. Take a sip of whatever's in your cup. Tell me what time it is where you are and where you're listening from. Because what happens next is where this story stops being simple and starts asking something back from the men who hear it." Caleb didn't make his next move right away. That was the hardest part. Men his age were raised to act, not wait. And the waiting gnawed at him worse than any bad decision ever had. For 3 days he stayed close to his ranch, fixing what didn't need fixing, riding fence lines that were already straight, letting his hands stay busy while his head worked. Every so often he caught himself listening for something that was not there. A wagon, hoofbeats, a shout carried wrong on the wind. Nothing came. On the 4th morning, a rider showed up just after sunrise. A young fellow, barely old enough to shave without cutting himself, riding a borrowed horse and holding his hat like he wasn't sure he deserved it. He said Deputy Crowley sent him. Said there'd been talk of rustling near the river, and Crowley wanted to come by and look things over himself. Caleb thanked him, gave him water for the ride back, and watched him go. That was Crowley testing the fence, not the wood kind, the other kind. By noon, Crowley arrived alone. No hurry, no badge talk. Just a man riding up like he owned the dirt beneath Caleb's boots. They walked the herd together. Slow and quiet, Crowley pointed out tracks that could have been anything. Caleb nodded like he was seeing it for the first time. They stopped near the river where the ground stayed soft. Crowley crouched and brushed dirt aside with his hand. That brand again, the sloppy one. "Funny thing," Crowley said. "Some of these marks are starting to look real questionable." Caleb felt the trap closing. He kept his voice even. "Cattle move. Brands blur. Happens every summer." Crowley stood, dusting off his hands. "Sure does. Be a shame if paperwork didn't match what's out here." He let that sit. Then he made the offer. Not loud, not threatening, just practical. A strip of land near the river, a signature, a quiet understanding. In return, Crowley said, he would make sure no one bothered Caleb. Not about the cattle, not about anything else. Caleb knew exactly what that meant. It meant the woman on the wagon would be allowed a doctor. It meant the rope might come off. It meant Crowley would still sleep easy. Caleb asked for time. Crowley smiled, like a man already paid. That night, Caleb poured himself a drink and stared at the paper Crowley left behind. He thought of the war again. Orders that promised safety and delivered graves. He didn't like the bargain. He just liked the idea of her seeing a doctor more than he liked his own pride. By morning, he signed. In his head, that signature felt like finishing the problem. In his gut, it felt like stepping onto a trap he'd helped set for himself. He rode into town and handed it back without ceremonies, and Crowley barely glanced at it. "You did the right thing," he said. "Most men don't." Caleb rode away with the taste of ash in his mouth. 2 days later, the trouble came anyway. A ranch hand from downriver burst onto Caleb's land near dusk, said cattle were missing, said Crowley and 2 others had been seen near Charleston the night before. By morning, the rumor was everywhere. Caleb Hartman was mixed up in rustling. That signed paper did not protect him. It marked him. By afternoon, 2 deputies rode up. Crowley stayed back, watching from a distance. They took Caleb in without drama. Just iron on his wrists and a walk that felt longer than it should have. The cell was hot. The bench splintered. No one asked questions. That night, someone hit him hard enough to make a point. Not enough to leave marks anyone would admit to seeing. Caleb lay awake after, staring at the ceiling, thinking about the paper he had signed, thinking